thanks so much for making time for the interview. And more importantly, thank you for this book that you've written that's due to be published here in another week or so. You're a professor and expert in international studies at Johns Hopkins. Let's begin with what brought you even to this subject matter of focusing not only on American cities, but American neighborhoods.
My day job, thank you, Pete, and thank you, Pooja, and I really appreciate this opportunity to do this. So my day job is working on fragile states, fragile societies all over the world. Literally, I'm on my phone or some call about Libya or about Nigeria or someplace like that. People know me for that in Washington. I have been known, at least up until now, as the fragile states person. And yet around 2015, 2016, and we know what was going on in American politics, then people started asking me, is America a fragile state? What is happening to our country, our institutions? And I had just come back from a very fragile country that you can't go on the highways without being worried about being kidnapped, or you worry about being sometimes even killed because you're a foreigner. Libya is certainly not a safe place, a place I don't go to. And so that question seems striking to me. So I took a step back. I had to say America is not a fragile state, but there's something in the society. And I firmly believe from all my work around the world that the state of any country's politics is a reflection of that country's society. And at the heart, any country's success depends on the nature of relationships. So I spent many years interviewing people, talking to people, and the conclusion of all that research and work and reading and traveling and interviews was that, yes, there's an issue with our relationships, and it's not the issue that makes the news, the polarization, the big stories that we see. It's something about the breakdown of our local relationships, our interpersonal dynamics, what's happening in our neighborhoods, what's happening with our local institutions. And that lies upstream from all the other problems we're having, from deaths of despair to rising mistrust to rising depression in our society.
So before we get into some of the specifics that you outline in the book, help the reader and viewer here to understand the kind of lens or lenses that you bring to analyzing fragile states, maybe as a way of understanding how you brought that set of questions, if you will, to exploring and understanding American cities and neighborhoods.
When I work in countries, I think most people, when they work on countries, they look at a lot of technical information. If they visit, they stay in the hotels or they meet government people. I don't work that way. I tend to work very bottom up. I want to know what are people thinking. I want to know how different parts of society are acting on each other or cooperating with each other or competing with each other. I want a deep reading of history. I want a deep reading of even novels, fiction. I want to spend time in people's homes, and I want to hear what the taxi drivers have to say. And of course, I'm reading all the technical stuff, but let's just say that first, my lens is much broader. And I think a lot of people, when they look at America's problems, they're thinking electoral systems, and they're thinking something about the political parties, and they're thinking there's a policy or a political answer to the questions. When I work around the world, there are policies that matter, and there are politicians that matter, and having better policies and politicians matter a lot. But my basic framework for looking at a country is try to understand what is going on in relationships. How are people experiencing life in that country day in and day out? And I think one of the problems we have in America is that we look for policy, we look to Washington for answers, we fight over what goes on politically, and we don't think enough about the local. That's in our personal as well as our professional lives. But I would say also the people who dominate the debates on what is wrong and what to do with the country, they're experiencing a very different version of America than people in the heartland, people around the country are experiencing. And until we put ourselves in the homes and in the shoes, literally put ourselves in the shoes, in the lives, and understand what has changed so dramatically in those people's lives over 2 generations, we cannot begin to understand what's going on in this country.
So if I understand you rightly, Seth, much of public policy analysis, whether it's carried out by academic institutions or by local government leaders, such as those who'll be watching this, tends to focus on the political institutions and what is happening currently. You're saying, if I understand you right, that we should take a more holistic approach to understand the social institutions and the history of a community if we are to understand these challenges rightly. Is that fair?
Correct. I would say, I mean, if you pick up the newspapers, and I read who knows how many newspapers, too many newspapers every day following the news. I mean, we all do. It happens to be a bit more relevant for my work, or maybe it's just my obsession, but it doesn't mean that what the newspapers are describing or what goes on in our government offices and or in our think tanks are covering the whole story. I think they're covering a part of the story, but they're missing a lot, partly because they themselves, the people who are running the media and the people who are running the think tanks, they are not experiencing life as most people are experiencing life. So you're getting a somewhat limited view. It's also, people are trained to think about the answers politically or policy, and they're also trained to think about answers in a very material and very individualistic way. And my argument is you need to look place by place. The word holistic that you used, Pete, was a very good word. I would use the word holistic, but you need to look at how people are experiencing life. What is the difference between, I mean, we've had in the last 60 years a dramatic change in how people are living lives in this country. There's been a lot of gains for that. We're economically more dynamic. We're wealthier. We have far more choices. Discrimination for all of the flaws we have now. People are not constrained if they have talent and they have the right networks as they might have been. We could talk about those things. But on the other hand, there's a great loss. There's a void on the ground where there used to be an abundance of institutions. And so for me, if you think of holistically about how people are experiencing life, and you're thinking holistically about what is going on in society that's affecting the average American, the policy element is only the piece of a much larger puzzle. I don't want to call it quite the tip of the iceberg because they're not really related, but I'm much more eager to understand structures that affect the dynamics of groups of people and places and networks. Then I'm interested in policy, especially policy that only thinks of us as individuals and that all we care about is some sort of material good. We do need some material goods, but that's not explaining our well-being. It's not explaining how we're feeling. It's not explaining how we're experiencing life on a daily basis.
I want to get to this because you're alluding to your last chapter in the book, which is titled Rethinking the American Dream. I want to get to that in due course, but I want to back up here to also look at the book through another kind of 15,000-foot screen, which is to say that this book is titled not Fragile States or Fragile Cities, but Fragile Neighborhoods. The scale or the scope at which you're considering this is not even at the city level,
no,
but at the neighborhood level. And for, again, those who are going to be either watching this or reading the transcript, why is it important for even local government leaders, which again are seen to be the ones that are most proximate to these issues, that they actually have to delve down a level deeper to the neighborhood level to better understand and react to some of these social challenges?
First, when we say local government, we are talking about a wide variety. So I'm assuming we might have local governments which are at the town level, in which their town is on some level a big neighborhood, or there might be county executives. And yes, different parts of the county might be different, but if they're a rural county, and as opposed to an urban government leader with several million people. So we're talking about a great diversity. And so but I think in all of these cases, there's a few things that we want to say. One is there's plenty of data, the most prominent data coming from Raj Chetty at Harvard about the different social outcomes based upon the neighborhood. I mean, he may be using zip codes, but what he really is talking about is neighborhoods, because it's hard to get data at neighborhood level. It's easy to get data at zip code level, but he's talking about huge gaps in just a child's prospects based upon where they live. And I think we can also look at, if we just walk around a city like Baltimore, or we walk around a city like, there's some variations in Washington, a place like Baltimore, the differences are huge. Detroit, there's so many of our cities where when I say get out of the hotels and get on the ground, nothing beats just walking around, seeing how people are experiencing life. You can physically see the huge differences. There's places where if you're going to look for a house, are you going to live in this neighborhood or that neighborhood? So people clearly understand this instinctively. If they have kids, they clearly want their kids not going to that neighborhood and going to this neighborhood. Some people, they live in those neighborhoods, so they don't really have those choices. So there's an instinctive element here that you can physically see it and feel it. You can certainly look at the data, but I think what's most important is that for the great majority of people, and this is certainly more true if you're poor, and this is more true if you're young and you're a child, the most important influences on you day in and day out are going to be in your home, on your street, in your neighborhood. And I think that is true for the great majority of people. There clearly are people who grow up in the airplane or grow up in those, someone was telling me they have 3 houses and they're jumping around. And I don't think that describes over 90% of Americans. And so I think for most of us, we underestimate, and maybe COVID help us understand how important the place we live is for our well-being. And I think we most realize it when we have a need, when we have a crisis, when there's something going on that you actually need to talk to people and be near people. There's only so much you can do with apps and so much you can do with Zoom. And it works at some level for some people, but there's an awful lot of people that doesn't work at all.
The book, Fragile Neighborhoods, is organized first, obviously, with some initial arguments, kind of setting the table. And then you go into exploring several different nonprofit organizations that are working on several different types of issues. Talk a bit about why you organized the book this way, and if you're a local government leader, why is it important for them to understand the role that these community organizations are playing within their city?
There's a couple of answers for that. First, I organized this book. First, I looked at what would be most useful. And so there's a lot of books lamenting, diagnosing what ails our society. I was hard pressed to find even one book that offered practical suggestions how to address the ills in our society. You see it bits here and there. Robert Putnam has written, he's made a whole career. He has the best data and some of the best books on how our society has evolved. But when you get to what to do about it, some of his suggestions are good, but they're not very comprehensive. Have more family dinners, I believe, is the main suggestion of one book. And so that's great. I believe that's important. Only about 30%, I believe, is the statistic of Americans have family dinners. And so I organized the book. So one answer to your question is I organized the book to start just the very beginning to lay out the problem, then emphasize the role of place, and then go into look at different entry points for change, and then to look at actual organizations that I thought were doing a good job, and then to bring it all together. Again, I think policy matters, but policy is never where I start. I start with what is going on in society and how we can work on these problems. And then if you look at all what's going on, you can draw up some practical policy suggestions because you're learning from what people are actually trying to do outside of government. So I would say one whole answer to your question is it's simply I tried to be as practical, as solutions oriented, and tried again. I would say second answer is I focused on society, and not most of these books they end with the policy question or the political question. They don't even get to all these social issues, and I just started with the social, and so that was very important for me. And I would just say I think a third level, of course, when I drafted it and I asked for advice, people say don't give them the answer at the beginning. You have to build some level of suspense, and you have to have some narrative that carries you through. And I had an early draft where I came up with some ideas early. They say don't put your ideas at the beginning. You have to have some sort of narrative arc. So the book is designed to, again, lay out the problem, go through what people are doing, and then end the last two chapters with some let's bring it all together for organizations and individuals. So there's some of that in the structure of the book.
Very good. Well, let's get into some of the recommendations, but maybe you raised something that I think might be important again for this particular audience to understand. One of the phrases that you use a lot, which is much better known in academia than it is in public administration circles, is the phrase social capital.
Yes.
That certainly is something that you are defining, discussing throughout the book. But why don't we define, or you define, the term social capital and why it's important to for local government leaders as maybe a way of framing how they understand the social and policy challenges in their own communities.
First, let's divide up social capital into, broadly speaking, two parts, what we might call bonding and bridging social capital. So social capital in general, it's not easy to measure. It's not like financial capital or human capital, but it's the same idea. It's a type of asset that we have based upon the nature of the relationships, institutions, and networks that we belong to. And you can think of how much social capital do I have or you have. I think a better way to think about it is how much social capital is operating at the level of a group or within a group. And so when we talk about bonding and bridging social capital, bonding social capital, simply put, is the amount of social support that people can expect to happen within their neighborhood, within their community, within their group. And this is basically, I would say the simple form is help when you have a need, social support when you have a challenge. I'm thinking of my daughter's best friend, who she spends a lot of time with, who unfortunately had to undergo chemo. My daughter is sixth grader, 11 years old. Her best friend underwent chemo the last 6 months, has no hair. I don't think it's starting to grow back yet. And then what happens to that daughter and that family because of you could call it a crisis, a tragedy, and neighbors come together, the community school comes together, people come together to support. I mean, that girl was in my house yesterday for lunch. My daughter is with her as this conversation goes on, but it's more than that. It's many, many families. It's doctors in the neighborhood. It's people checking up on them. It's people volunteering to help them. And it's the type of social support they get that girl feels so much confidence and encouragement. She even went away for a special camp for a week, something involving a nonprofit in my neighborhood. So they got help on many, many levels to get them through this crisis. And that is a very good example of bonding social capital in action. Bridging social capital is, in the simple way to think about it, is between groups, in my case, between neighborhoods, possibly between neighborhoods and the rest of society. So you can think about that as access to opportunity through networks, through institutions. You can think of it on the negative side, when there's discrimination against a group of people or against a neighborhood, which was very typical when we had segregation. Those neighborhoods have zero or very limited bridging social capital and are therefore systematically excluded from opportunities outside of their neighborhoods. But on the positive side, you can think about it as somebody needs a job and somebody needs to get help dealing with the government. I mean, here is my neighborhood. It happens to be because of what is going on. There's some concerns about security in my neighborhood, and I'm texting somebody I know who's involved with security at one of the institutions, and he's talking to the county, the people in charge of security and the police for the county. And this is happening in the last 24 hours, and they're immediately mobilizing their network to help the neighborhood. And so bridging social capital is about mobilizing external resources to help yourself, help other people. And so we need to think of these things as very important. When they don't exist, we're individuals, we're vulnerable, we're at risk, and we feel anxious. And we're not able to do things that we want to do. We're not able to get support we want, need, but also we feel mistrustful. We feel alienated. We're more likely to act destructively in society.
Is it fair to say that if more local government leaders were to take this kind of social capital, fragile neighborhood view of the policy challenges facing their communities, that they would almost ipso facto understand that it's not just the government's issue to respond to these problems, that there needs to be this gathering of public sector, or what we would call in other areas, kind of a cross-sector approach to responding to these challenges?
Public officials need to understand that we cannot improve schools, we cannot improve security, we cannot improve healthcare outcomes, and so on and so forth, if there are not strong structures in society. What we have, in our last 60 years, we have gone from a society with strong local structures. They were not perfect, they had a lot of problems, to a network society that basically means that there's a lot of places without strong structures and a lot of people who are vulnerable. And if we hope to improve schools, we hope to reduce the cost of government, if we hope to deal with challenges, everything from homelessness to problems of housing, to problems of healthcare costs, and so on and so forth. I mean, we could name everything a government does that involves the citizens. Clearly, foreign policy and some issues like that would be excluded. But what local governments do, I cannot think of a single thing a local government does, except maybe its finance and accounting arms, that doesn't involve the citizens and would not be enhanced, costs reduced, services improved, if there was strong bonding and bridging social capital. So to not think about these things is simply to ask for your costs to be higher, for your services to be less effective, and for satisfaction of government to be lower and mistrust higher and things like that.
One of the phrases you also use in the book, Fragile Neighborhoods, is what you call a sideways approach to these issues. Could you talk a bit about what the sideways approach is, and maybe how local government leaders in particular might be able to implement it or at least consider it?
By sideways, I mean two things. I mean sideways within our neighborhood and sideways across neighborhood. So that you can think of that as bonding relationships, or the relationships across people. This is where local institutions become so important, because they are incubators, nurturers of relationships. Relationships don't happen out of the blue. They happen because there's activities and institutions locally. When there's an abundance, you have it. And then across, we talked about bridging social capital. So when I think about what a local government official needs to think about, they need to stop thinking about their location or their city or their town in a very vertical manner. Stop measuring it just on material economic indicators. They need to, and also stop thinking that overall success is success, because you can have good economic results and it could be leaving 25% or 50% of a population out. We need to be measuring results horizontally across a landscape, and within each neighborhood, we need to be somehow, and we could discuss what that means, we need to be measuring relational, social indicators place by place. So you could have overall rising numbers, yet you could be having many parts of your area not doing well, basically building up problems that will eventually come back and haunt you. So we need to think very horizontally about success on multiple levels.
I want to turn things over to Pooja here in a second to really drill down on some takeaways for local government leaders. But I want to get at your last chapter, which I mentioned before, which is rethinking the American dream. Now, this is much more of a social commentary, but an important one, because, as you rightly say, so much of our work in public policy analysis and public administration education is data-driven and metrically based, right? We're looking to reduce...
Economically data-driven. Data is good. The question is, do we have the right data? That's my question. And
so
we have some of the right data, but we don't have other data that's very important.
Very good distinction. I want to come to that in 1 second, but let me just ask part A of this, what will be a two-part question. Describe the purpose for this concluding chapter, Rethinking the American Dream. What's your argument there, and why should local government leaders consider it?
Well, I would say that the American dream today seems to be a dream of individuals trying to gain some sort of individual material wealth, and that is all. And that is a very, I would say, very limited, very narrow understanding of the American dream. The American dream originally, when this term first came into fashion, we're talking, I believe, the progressive era, it was about uplifting people, uplifting all of society. Somehow we went from a more societal worldview to a worldview that's very individual and very material. And so I argue in that last chapter, but I think the idea pervades my book, is that we need, I'm all for capitalism. I'm all for more wealth. We surely need cities, towns. We all need economic strength to do things we want to do. It's important, and fighting poverty is important. But I would say that individual happiness and city, town, neighborhood success is a lot more than the material needs of individuals. The relationships, I mean, I have data, and if I give a presentation, I'd have data showing the gap between American lifespans and the lifespans of other developed countries. And these two have been diverging for 40 years. And if anything, it's gotten worse in the last 10 or 15 years. And that's not because we're not becoming wealthier. We as a country, we're the wealthiest large country in the world. And on the whole, we're getting richer and richer. And yet we are losing more and more people. And that is because we're not measuring, we're not prioritizing issues or steps, or in this case, policies, if you're a government leader, that would strengthen society, encourage a strong society, encourage the development of strong structures in society, encourage strong relationships place by place. It's only with strong community and strong social structures that we can lift up people, actually. Even those who are very successful, they're very successful. I'm sure they're very smart, but it's also because they have networks. We should never underestimate the importance of social networks and in terms of how well you do. The networks when you grow up, the networks you form in school, the networks you form professionally. To the extent that people have no networks or they have the wrong networks, they have very little future or very heavy constraints on their ability to improve their lives. And so this idea of the American dream is, if we all think about ourselves and we all think materially, we're all, a great many of us are going to be left behind, and a great many of us may chase that dream and end up in much worse shape. We may end up lonelier, we may end up more depressed, we may end up in that nice house, but all alone. And that's not a recipe for a successful life. It's not a recipe for a successful town or city, and it's really not a recipe for a successful country.
And you make a distinction there, and it's in one of the earlier chapters, that you can achieve the so-called material American dream and be materially very successful. You could have this low social capital or a series of broken relationships, yet still be quite wealthy. This isn't just that kind of distinction where the poor don't have those relationships and the rich do.
I think when I say social poverty as distinct from material poverty or income poverty, I think it is not, it is correlated, broadly speaking, with economic poverty, but it is certainly not the same thing. You can find poor places with social wealth. I mean, think of immigrant communities, think of some religious communities, think of the Amish, and we could give many other examples. They're not materially wealth, but they're in a very strong community, and they have a lot of social support, and they have, I mean, if everyone is on the street poor, that would be an extreme. But if you're poor and you have a home and you have, you're not terribly rich, but you have a lot of strong relationships, you can be doing much better on a personal, and that community could be doing much better on a communal level than someone who has a big house and has very, very limited family, friends, network. I mean, you may have some of that professionally, and you may have achieved a lot, but think about if you have a crisis, who do you go to? If you're feeling anxious, who do you talk to? If you're feeling vulnerable, people today, especially when they're materially well off, they're afraid to show that they're vulnerable. I mean, I always say one of the great things about my neighborhood, which has got very close relationships, is that I get to see on an intimate level the problems of other people, and everyone has problems, and we're more open with problems because our relationships are different. And I mean, my family has its own problems. Problems between my wife and I, problems with our kids, and sometimes maybe it would be worse. But when you look around and you see what goes on with other people, well, first you have lessons learned. Second, you have support. And three, you have a sense of reality. This isn't so bad. We're doing pretty well. And then you feel that, oh, we can manage it. We can get on with it. And so there's something about interdependency and intimacy, and none of that constrains any of us from achieving what we're achieving professionally. It just means that you have a different mindset about how you go about your life, and you are involved in more institutions. And you're in the case I make in the book, you should be more involved in your neighbors and your neighborhood institutions, and you're gaining by giving. Giving is a way of gaining, and if everyone gives, everyone gains double, triple. And that's the type of society we used to have, in society that some of us have today, but not most of us.
Pooja, let's throw it over to you for some takeaways for local government folks.
So as we think about local governments as they're working at the staff, at the city, county, town, et cetera level, and also thinking about those that are working in community-based organizations, in your opinion, what is the first step that local government leaders and staff members can take to help build and foster strong neighborhoods and strong communities?
First, I think they should rethink the physical landscape around distinct neighborhoods with distinct identities, distinct centers, and distinct institutions. Most of our country has been physically designed to be placeless. A lot of houses, no center, no local institutions, no community schools. The more we design the physical landscape and then the institution, so at the institutional level, a community school is very helpful for nurturing relationships. Some sort of identity, distinct identity with distinct center with shops. In my neighborhood, we don't have a very pretty center because it's like a little mall, but we have 3 restaurants, we have a pharmacy, we have a supermarket. I cannot walk into one of those restaurants without seeing somebody I know. In fact, I know the owners of one of them relatively well, 2 of them at least by face, and then there's a supermarket. I mean, so just the idea that you have local shops and you have a distinct neighborhood, and that neighborhood has distinct edges, could be a green area, something, and then it has local institutions. Some of them have nothing to do with government, but local churches. If I was a religious leader and I was listening to this, I'd be asking myself, why is my church or other religious house of worship not more place-based, neighborhood-based? They used to be, they're not. So that would be one thing I would think very hard about everything that the government does. And you could even argue that instead of having functions serving my area, that there should be a teams of people that are more neighborhood-based and neighborhood accountable. So we're not measuring housing units. We're not measuring hospital beds filled. We're not measuring some sort of students and seats at schools. No, we're measuring how well the neighborhoods are doing, which leads to my second point. We need indicators. So the first point is the landscape. I think the second point would be rethinking government to make it more neighborhood oriented. A third point which supports that would be to have indicators to measure neighborhood health. That would be something. I would say a fourth thing governments can do is think of some sort of small grant programs that incentivize neighbors to cooperate to improve their neighborhoods. These are not big grants. They're small grants, but they're not given to individuals. They're given to groups of people and local institutions to encourage cooperation and to think really, we don't need dramatic change in the short term. I mean, we can think longer term about some of these things, but just by encouraging people to cooperate to improve their neighborhoods, we are changing the dynamic. So if we're measuring results and we're incubating relationships and we're incentivizing cooperation and we're thinking about distinct places and we're measuring success by these places, all of this is kind of a change in mindset and how it affects everything that we do. And the idea is we're trying to build structures, encourage structures, and not just think of material outcomes in individuals.
Thank you. I think that advice that you're giving here on changing our perspectives is especially important for all levels of local government leaders, but specifically those are perhaps new. We're seeing this wave of new staff members at local governments and in these offices. When we think about those who are maybe listening to this or reading this and they're 3 weeks into their job or 3 months into their job, is there a specific piece of advice you would give to those who are just starting to develop their understandings of community and place in their new jobs?
First, I would hope that their job is a place and they're not being evaluated by more units, because when we're evaluating more units, we just build more units without thinking how those units, you can actually build more housing units and make a place worse because you congregate all the poor people in the area in one place, which is not good for that neighborhood, actually. So when we think about place and not think about units, we have a very different mindset about how things are. So but I would say the first thing that I would highly recommend is, assuming that you are responsible for a place, is to walk around, learn the place, learn the people, learn the institutions, create a map in your head of what is going on. Try to understand. There's something called appreciative inquiry, a very simple appreciative inquiry. Try to appreciate by a series of questions of people. What are people thinking? What is it that they see would be helpful to improve in their neighborhood? And what incremental steps? I'll give a specific example. In my neighborhood, there's a specific traffic signal that's between the neighborhood and this little mall that we live near. People did not like the traffic signal. So they basically petitioned and talked to the government to change the way the signal worked so it would be more pro-pedestrians crossing the street. And a simple thing like that, very small thing, every time you're there, and I mean, I happen to know what they did. Most people may not know what they did, but you appreciate that this is much easier to cross than it was before. And other things that things were done with the streets to have more areas for people to cross, streets that were busier. I mean, these are very simple things. Sometimes people are asking for stop signs. Some people are, these are all very small things. But the idea is when you're among the people and you're working with the people and you know a place and you know the organizations, you have connections, you're gonna begin to see things from their view, and you're gonna begin to learn what's there, and always ask, what is it that can incrementally improve this place? How do I open up channels of communication so I can get some sort of feedback loops on performance, feedback loops on how what we're doing is affecting this place, and so on and so forth. Again, think of your job as cooperating with people, collaborating with people to make a place better. And the more we see ourselves as facilitators and not just planners with some sort of long-term mandates around numbers, the more likely that we will actually make people's lives better.
Thank you. I have one last question for you.
Please, we can have more. It's up to you.
Where do you see potential for hope in neighborhoods in America? Earlier, you mentioned that so many books speak about all the things that are wrong, but where do you see space for hope?
Well, there's clearly hope that that Americans are by nature people who want to get out and do things. I think this is one of the things that if you have foreign eyes, and I have somewhat foreign eyes when I walk around America, given all the years I lived out of the country, one thing you cannot doubt is the desire of people to actually do something, to get out and direct their energy to improve the country, however they define that. And I think, so I have hope in the energy of the people. I have hope in the history of our country. We've had one other great period in our history where we had dramatic change in the 19th century, urbanization, industrialization, and mass immigration, and a whole stream, a whole wave of social innovation and new nonprofits and place-based, like chapter-based national organizations formed. And so we had this whole period of innovation. And so when I see the energy of Americans and I see this history, my hope is that we can replicate that. But I think the key to that is we have to stop looking to Washington and looking to politicians and looking to policy for answers. These things may all matter, but it's a very incomplete picture. The more we think about what we can do locally, I don't, nothing against national organizations, but sending a check-in or getting on social media or just fighting for some policy change and advocacy or whatnot, that has value, but I would argue it has less value than going into your neighborhood or a nearby neighborhood and actively joining an organization, joining a committee, volunteering for something, and actually trying to make a difference on real people and real problems. And most of our polarization is because it's distant. When we come together locally and we work together, we don't ask, are you Republican or Democrat? We just want to solve a practical problem. And for the most part, like traffic lights, it's not a problem that's going to divide us by red and blue. It's going to say, well, that makes sense. We all want to get across that street. How do we get across that street in a better fashion? And so there's loads of these problems, improving schools, and we're not always going to agree, but these are practical problems that bring people together. So I have hope in the history and I have hope in the nature. I just think we need to reorient ourselves in terms of what we're focusing on and how we're thinking about the problems.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just a couple final questions for me. One is, I know it's not the stated purpose of the book, but in some ways it's been my sometimes stated purpose for the work that we do at the Davenport Institute, which is to, just drafting off of what you just said, that understanding these national issues around polarization, that one of the ways that we can confront those is by focusing more at the local level. Do you have a sense that this more of a neighborhood-based community, dare I say, communitarian approach might actually have, to borrow a term, positive externalities for the national polarization that so many are understanding?
In my book, I certainly touch upon this issue, even though, of course, it's not the main focus. But my argument is that everything from deaths of despair to depression, to the problems we have with lots of youth, to the problems of mistrust and polarization, these lie downstream from how our relationships have changed in neighborhoods and in specific places. And so I certainly believe if we were to focus much more on the local, it would first suck energy out of some of this, I would say, debilitating debates that don't seem to end with anything very constructive. Lots of energy. I don't want to say that it's not. I'm all for voting. I'm all for protesting and supporting one policy versus another. But I do think a lot of our mistrust and polarization nationally would be healed if we redirected our energy more to local problems and local solutions, things we can do to make where we live better. I also think that one of the reasons why we put so much into politics is because we're alone, we're vulnerable, we don't have strong social connections. There's certainly data that says that people with strong social connections are going to think much more positively about politics, and they're going to be much more trustful of politicians and government. And so it's not only redirecting our energies, I think that would be positive, but I also think the redirection and the greater social connectiveness and the engagement locally will change our views of how the country is and what our opinions is of politics. And I'd also add, I mean, when we talk about politics and we talk about our role in government, we should think how important local government, local elections are. If we put as much energy into improving our local governments as we put into national politics, maybe a lot of places would be a much better. So I certainly would encourage listeners or readers, we also need to do a lot more locally. Don't think of patriotism as national only. It's national and local, and that's the same for political and social engagement.
That's brilliant. Anything we haven't touched on, Seth, from the book, especially given the audience that we're going to be reaching through this? Is there something that I didn't ask, or maybe Pooja didn't ask, that you said, boy, if I had a chance to stand in front of a 1,000 city managers and planners and mayors, I really would want to make sure they heard this?
I would reiterate the importance of thinking of the landscape, thinking of the different tools of government in terms of how everything about government affects the structures in society and affects the physical and institutional landscape that people experience. For me, the problem is a physical one. We build roads, they're not roads to nowhere, but we seem to spend a lot more effort making our roads better than we do making our neighborhoods better. We spend very little time thinking that neighborhoods are important. And the way we run government seems to be about outputs instead of about relationships. And so I would just encourage government leaders to try to think again about the physical and institutional landscape. How is it the way we operate a government? How is it how we measure success? How is it how we engage with people? How is it that we even how we allocate funds that go to nonprofits? Are we allocating funds in ways that encourage an abundance of local institutions place by place? Are we designing zoning in a way that encourages people just to live in houses that are isolated from each other and with no way for them to ever meet locally? I mean, we're talking about everything from zoning to how funding is allocated to the structure of government. All these things, again, have, it's not the policy per se, but it's some combination of a lot of things we're doing that seems to be almost designed to isolate people, separate them from each other. And if we had different ways of structuring society, making the physical landscape, nurturing or designing institutions, allocating money, we would be doing a lot more that would create thicker bonds, creating stronger structures, creating more social bonding, bridging capital. And so I'll just encourage you. I'm on some level, I'm literally thinking of a radical change in how we think of government. And I don't expect everyone listening to this to be able to do this tomorrow. But I would just say, if you started with a blank slate and you thought that relationships and social dynamics matter place by place, how would government actually function? And so I would just encourage people to think about that and then think about what they can do to at least take baby steps in this direction.
Wow, Seth, you're really dropping some incredible wisdom here. Pooja, did you have anything else that you wanted to raise?
That's all I had. Thank you.
No,
Seth,
I'm
thanks
grateful.
again.
I'm grateful that you let me do this.